So we're going to move on now to our first panel, which is sponsored by View Vision Therapy, and it's going to focus on the topics of risk perceptions and prevention. And one of the biggest things that we want to talk about during this time is understanding how concussions and just understanding the mindset before concussion happens, and the perspective that we need to have. And I'm really excited to bring our amazing panelists to the stage here because we have an incredible list of speakers that are very passionate and share an interest in education, knowledge translation, and research. So if you guys can join me right now, as they make their way here, I'll introduce them. We have Stephanie Cowle, who is the Director of Knowledge Translation at Parachute Canada. Michael Jorgensen, who is a PhD candidate at University of Toronto. And Dr. Kaleigh Pennock, who is an assistant professor at University of Waterloo. So gonna welcome them. A quick note, I just want to let everyone know when we talk about concussion prevention, we're not talking about advanced technology and equipment. We're talking about the decision-making processes that we can put for preventative measures because that is a common thing that people don't fully understand. And with that, I'm going to pass it to the facilitator and my colleague, Ryan Sutton, to...
Thanks. Oh, whoa. That was... Thanks, Seth. Yeah, we're really excited to dive into this topic of risk perceptions and prevention, and we're going to be, as Seth mentioned, focusing a bit more on the social side of it and diving into those different factors. And we definitely are confident with our panel up here that we're going to be able to talk about a lot of great things. And with the interest of time, as Seth mentioned, we're going to dive right into it. So my first question will be to Mike here, and we're looking to understand a bit more about the different risk factors with the research that you did, learning about the risk factors and how that may impact athletes' concussion experience or how they view concussion.
Yeah, so thanks, Ryan. So looking at concussions and just risk broadly, individuals, not just athletes, frame their understanding of risk or their framing of risk is deeply contextualized. And we see that in sport specifically, factors like cultural factors and the social environment and their personal experience all sort of play into how that shakes out in a concussion situation. And so, I guess starting high level with it, at cultural factors, we see things like factors with specific to different sports. If we're going to compare something like boxing to baseball, for instance, I'm thinking of the Mike Tyson quote, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. When it comes to boxing, that's very much a sign up for experience. There's an understanding intrinsic in that sport that head contact is part of it. Yet, if you were to flip that to a baseball player, I think they'd probably take exception to a right hook from an opponent. However, if you look to things like foul tip impacts and player-on-player impacts sliding to base, those are understood as, that's just baseball. These things happen, these things occur. And how these events and actions are normalized can affect how athletes then subsequently behave in those instances and navigate things like recovery and prevention efforts. From a social sort of perspective, the social environment, we have athletes interact and engage with other sport stakeholders, coaches, teammates, administrators, and their understandings of risk influence their behaviors as well. An athlete has a very different framing of what risk means, what concussion means, than an administrator would, who might look at the risk to the sport, the ability to grow the game, to recruit and retain participants. Whereas the athlete is just thinking, hey, I want to go out and run around with my friends. I choose to recreate by participating in sport. And I choose this sport for, the social aspects, the camaraderie, the competition. And so as a result of that, when we look at risk and concussion, the framing of that is considerate of those social factors. Their ability to participate with friends, engage in meaningful competition with others, that's not taken in vacuum there. And then looking specific to the athlete themselves, we know previous concussion history is one of the strongest risk factors for future concussion. And when we look at some of the research that I've done, it's interesting how those experiences frame athletes' conceptualization of risk moving forward. For instance, we had a study, or I'm doing a study right now with amateur rugby athletes here in Ontario. And I asked them, what does risk mean to you? What does this look like in terms of your past concussion injuries? And those who have had concussion injuries in the past, who had very extreme, sort of on the high end in terms of symptom expression and dysfunction as a result of that, they look at future suspected concussions or incidences of head contact with a bit of a different lens. My symptoms in the past were experienced as this. They were extreme, they were intense, I was out for months. I couldn't participate, I couldn't go to school, I couldn't think, my sleeping was off, all of these things. But, I just took a baseball to the head, sliding into base, and I only have a bit of a headache, so that definitely can't be concussion. Because to me, concussion is all of these severe symptoms. And so based on that experience, we really have to be considerate of how that individual, how that group, that social group, and then how that sport perceives concussion, perceives risk, and views that relative to our own sort of understandings of it. Yeah.
Hello. That was great, Mike. And for someone like myself who has sustained multiple concussions in sport, and also very different concussions, I definitely can relate to that because I still, to this day, am struggling with removing myself, even with all the information I have available to me and with all of the experiences that I've been through. It's still hard to do, and the culture around sport is definitely impacting that. Luckily for me, I've always had my mom to tell me about my brain health and how important that is, so really appreciate everything that she's done for that. But the one thing in my experience was the teammates and the coaches and how they impacted my scenarios where they didn't necessarily know what was going on, nor did they have any idea of how to even handle somebody going through a concussion. And this was a bit back before Rowan's Law and everything, but still it really impacted what I went through. And I guess this brings me to my next question, which I'm going to bring to Dr. Pennock. Just what type of things impact reporting behaviors with athletes and other sport stakeholders, and what is the onus on sport stakeholders to understand more and to do more?
This is on. Yes, maybe. Okay. Yes, it's a great question, and underreporting of concussions is, I don't want to say a hot topic, but it's certainly an important one. And part of the issue with concussions and with reporting is we kind of view concussions as this invisible injury, right? Concussions can be so different from athlete to athlete, and even for an athlete, they can be different from concussion to concussion. So a lot of the onus tends to fall on the athlete to readily report their concussion to a coach, to a trainer, to a parent, and so on. But what we're seeing in the literature is that athletes don't report, and I'm sure for many of you as clinicians, coaches, healthcare professionals involved in sports, parents, you might know of athletes who continue to play through their injury. So a lot of my research has focused on looking at underreporting and what's causing that. And Mike alluded to a lot of these concepts when we start to think of the sociocultural and the psychosocial environments that are around an athlete and what makes them to choose to report or to not. And one of the big factors that I could definitely draw on is the sport environment itself and how that's kind of shaped around the coach-athlete relationships and then athletes' relationships with their peers. So when athletes are in environments where the culture is around playing through pain, pushing through injury, demonstrating your toughness, it makes it really difficult for athletes to kind of go against the grain and say something. And it's almost like that there's this sweet spot that's happening where athletes, they know that they shouldn't underreport. Generally, athletes tend to demonstrate a high level of concussion knowledge, and when you ask them about clinical symptoms, they tend to be able to kind of list them off, especially in Ontario where we have Rowan's Law and we have this required level of education. But then you have athletes who kind of get into this debate with themselves over whether or not they want to report something. So it's almost this sweet spot between athletes don't necessarily want to underreport, but they also don't want to overreport. And by overreport, I mean athletes who aren't quite sure if they have a concussion or not. So maybe they tell their coach or they tell the trainer, and then they're pulled out of the game or the practice or the competition, and then they can't go back in. And then maybe they get assessed and it wasn't actually a concussion. So in some of the work that I've done, athletes have expressed this fear over this uncertainty that I could end up over-reporting and then I can't play and I let my team down and so on. So I think part of navigating this kind of worrisome area is around the climate, and that's the climate at the coach level within the club to promote that, hey, if you go off and if you have to report, you can come back in. Like, I'm not going to give up your spot. Like, I'm not going to put Billy might come in, but you'll be back as soon as you're healthy. And coaches starting to foster that climate that supports athletes wanting to play. But then this also needs to come through at the sport administration and the club level, right? How are sport clubs and sport organizations supporting concussion policy? And are they able to start shifting the culture in the club where that becomes the norm rather than athletes not saying anything at all? And some of that will also come through with policy, right? Having policy changes where athletes can actually be removed from play and then be sent back in. But some sports, unfortunately, don't allow that at all, right? If you're taken out, that's it. So I think it's a multi-level problem, and it's going to take a really multifaceted solution for us to move forward with it.
Absolutely. And I think that's going to be a common theme that we're experiencing today, is that at least for us here at Heads Up, we believe it takes everyone. And that's obviously common in the research, and I appreciate you sharing that for sure. And obviously, another aspect to that is education and policy. And that's who better to talk about that than Steph here, who she actually was part of the leadership team for the Concussion Harmonization Project in 2017. And she was able to help bring concussion guidelines to, I think it was, Seth told me it was 50. I thought it was 49, over 50 provincial and national level sport organizations. So my question to you, Steph, is based on what happened in 2017, how have you seen the culture of sport and concussions shifting since then? And then also on top of that, where are we headed next in terms of education and policy?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just give a really brief overview of what we're talking about with the Concussion Harmonization Project. So this was work Parachute-led starting in 2016 with the federal ministers of sport and health, as well as with national sport organizations, health professionals, and a whole whack of collaborators. I think that's the theme of today. And really the point was that sports in particular and other stakeholders across the country were kind of trying to tackle this issue of concussion. It had become a hot topic, particularly following Sidney Crosby's injuries. And suddenly it was on the radar and everyone was trying to figure it out. And so we were looking at how across the country do we create a bit of a standard around evidence-informed protocols and guidance for sport organizations, for parents, for athletes, for health professionals and educators, and get everyone on the same page and following the evidence. Because there's no reason that one child playing soccer in New Brunswick should have a completely different protocol experience to a child playing hockey in Ontario. The evidence points us to pretty good simple principles of best practice. And so it was, how do we get there? Where do we start? And what do we do? And so we created the Canadian Guideline on Concussion in Sport, which kind of follows the idea of our clinical practitioners have clinical practice guidelines. We had a talk about, clinical practice and looking at the evidence and how that gets distilled into recommendations. What about everyone else outside of the medical field? How do sport organizations know what the research is saying, what the best recommendations are? And the organizations that we spoke to really wanted to hear from health. Tell us what to do. We'll implement it, but we can't all expect to be experts. Early on, sports like hockey and rugby and football experienced public pressure to address concussion. Those were the obvious ones, and also had resources and access to medical professionals and others who could help them develop the policies they were doing. But again, what about all the other sports that don't have those resources, or we may not think about concussion happening in them? Volleyball, basketball, soccer, And just a hint, I've even worked with lawn bowling and other sports to develop concussion protocols. It's not just about how risky the sport is. So one of the changes has been this acceptance a little bit. I won't say it's perfect, but a bit more acceptance that concussion protocol and policy is inherent to a sport organization's functioning, and it's not just for certain sports. All sports should be aware. Concussions can happen to participants outside of their sport. It can happen in the rest of their life. It's kind of funny. We try and compartmentalize things, but you're taking the same brain throughout your life. So, we need to be aware that these injuries can happen elsewhere. And also, they can happen within the sport participation sphere, not necessarily in game or practice. There's famous athletes that have sustained concussions falling in the locker room or in their hotel. All of these reasons why sports will ask, well, why do we need this? And there's, a whole laundry list of reasons. So certainly a bit more acceptance of that. And actually now in Canada, we're in a place where Sport Canada now has mandated that any national sport organization they fund has to have a policy and protocol. And they do recommend that it's in accordance with our guideline on concussion in sport. So that has been a big change. And in terms of where we're going, I mean, that's a starting point. Having a policy that doesn't, then we have to look at implementation and how things are happening on the ground. And that's where really that partnership with sport and with health professionals that work with sport and volunteer with sport is really important to understanding, okay, yes, this is the pretty algorithm on paper, what's really happening, and where are the challenge points. So one really interesting one, we did some research with the University of Calgary and talked about, okay, people are aware of protocols, what are the biggest implementation challenges? One with recognition and removal is most people who are familiar with concussion resources are familiar with the concussion recognition tool or have heard of it. We have a new CRT6 now from the Amsterdam Consensus Conference, and people say, "Yeah, I know that. It's to help." If anyone's not aware, it's a free tool. It's not for health professionals. It's for anyone to recognize a possible concussion. It's not a diagnostic tool. It's got signs and symptoms, some memory questions, and just to kind of get a sense of, is there a potential concussion here and should this athlete be removed? But people have no confidence using it. So we have this tool, and then all of a sudden people are in a situation, and we know situations like this can be very high stakes, even at the very young grassroots community level, and we're asking people to make a decision that they don't have necessarily the confidence and capacity to do. So one of the things we started doing when we do our, webinars, of course, because of the pandemic, and other training events, is it's a start, but doing practice runs, scenarios with the CRT. I liken it to if you do CPR first aid training. They give you all the info, then they make you get on the ground and implement it. Okay, tell that person to call, you in the red shirt, call 911, and they have to do the compression. I don't know, for anyone who's done that, you feel so awkward being thrust into that moment, and it's fake, right? And also all of a sudden you forget everything you're supposed to do. We don't do that to train people to recognize concussion. What do you do in the moment? So in terms of where we're going right now, I think really those points of implementation, how do we work together to equip people to use the information? It's available now like ever before. We're so lucky in Canada. But then we have to equip people with the confidence, because there's a lot of fear around doing the wrong thing, pulling someone for no reason, liability, any number of things. So that's really where we'd like to strengthen at this time. It's an important goal.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, everything you just said there was amazing. So thank you for sharing. I think it's funny for us because we recently launched our education program, and we have something where we educate these students in high schools, and we're really excited. They're excited and all this stuff. But then when we have this secondary aspect to it where we're doing awareness with them, we're building an awareness campaign with them. And it's amazing to see the drop off in what we think they know in terms of what they actually are able to do. So then that's where the real learning starts, is when you're actually implementing it with them in the moment, and like doing those practice runs to give them the confidence that they can actually talk to somebody about that. So yeah, that's a really great point, Stefan. I really appreciate everybody on the panel here sharing or all the information that you did. I think at this time we are going to open it up for the Q&A. So if anybody has any questions at all for our amazing speakers here, please raise your hand, and Seth has a mic here that we can bring around to anybody.
I don't know who quite to aim this at, so I'll just throw it out. You mentioned working with the group in Calgary. So there's a great group there of rodeo participants. How are you going to convince a cowboy to come out? So that's problem number one. Number two, soccer is the number one participation sport in Ontario, and yet the Ministry of Health just released their study that there's minimal concussion seen in soccer. But we as clinicians know that's absolutely incorrect. How do we overcome this?
Your first point is, again, speaking to that culture and the challenges. We're talking about challenges broadly, but then once you get into different activities, different sport cultures, those are going to be unique. And I know within the rodeo community, there's been some pretty devastating losses with long-term damage, suicide due to following brain injury, things like that. So certainly take your point. I don't think I can describe right now exactly the solution for a rodeo, but your point really well taken, that we do really need to work within and understand each implementation context. That was one of the first things that I had to start with working with the amateur sports system across Canada, is start understanding the world that was happening and understanding all the different relationships, all the drivers. Funding comes into account. Like you mentioned, a whole bunch of other factors that come into account there. I'm not totally I haven't seen the ministry report that you're referring to. I mean, in the literature, concussion in soccer is quite documented. I can't really comment because I haven't seen how that is phrased. But certainly we know that, government support is of critical importance, especially in the sports sphere, where that's where a lot of funding comes from our sport organizations. Not everything, the solution to everything, the best solution is not always mandating. But in some ways, that and the control of the purse strings can be, something that helps. But I'm not totally familiar with that report. I would love to see that. Thank you.
Just to your first question there, I guess this goes back to what I said, where people's understanding of risk is deeply contextualized. I'm sure if you ask them what risk means to them, concussion probably wouldn't even be. It'd be, I need to make certain times to stay on the rodeo circuit. I need to longevity in sport is probably not in the top few reasons there. And I think that's something that I don't know what the solution is, but having conversations and challenging some of those just taken for granted assumptions that come along with a sporting culture and are embedded within sporting cultures is probably a good first step. Yeah.
Definitely, organizational influences. So we've worked with organizations where certain people were really on board, but whether the person at the top was, or whether the board of directors was, or others, so understanding where those levers are, right?
And I think drawing on the point about soccer, and I also haven't seen this report, but a lot of grassroots sport and recreational sport is volunteer driven, right? So a lot of that labor around concussion management is offloaded to the parents and the volunteers who are there supporting their kids or whomever's playing. So I think part of it from a sport management perspective is also looking at the capacity of some of these clubs. So how do they have the tools? Do they have the resources to deliver concussion training? Can they help parents and other sport actors become more involved? Because I really think there's a shared responsibility that has to happen, particularly at the youth level, and that it can't just all be unloaded to the athlete getting a concussion and then they're removed from that sport system until they're healed and then brought back in. I think a more collective approach might be the way forward.
And I know there's a new question, but just really quickly, just framing the whole issue of surveillance and data available in Canada and Ontario. I could do a whole other talk on health data surveillance for injury. I won't, but we don't actually really know the numbers.
Okay, well, thank you for that question, Drew. Much appreciated. Does anybody else? Oh, we got back here.
Hello. Hi, just working with national level athletes that are getting carded. So on the podium, it's all based on points and the more funding that team gets and how well they perform, it's all based on performance. So not only are these carded athletes, they're students, they're working, and if they lose, like, is there any kind of implementation of like giving them a buy if they're injured? Like, they're so reluctant to come forward and actually report that they have an injury because they're afraid of losing their card, their funding, and letting their team down because it takes away the points and the funding for their team.
It's a really good point. Nothing in the works that I'm aware of, but that's something that I would be interested to get HeadsupCAN engaged in. HeadsupCAN is, for lack of a better term, kind of a union that represents athletes at kind of Pan Am Game, Olympic, Paralympic level athletes, and that's the kind of thing they look at. But in a kind of related tangent, and Kaleigh alluded to this, we also see that within the rules of sports, right? So, for example, we can't take this player off to even check if they should be removed, because if I take them out, they're out of the game. There's rules within sport and policies that impact. We have started to see shifts in that. So, for example, Skate Canada changed their rules. A figure skater can stop their program, get a quick check. It's not ideal, but at least they can check and see if they should be considering a head injury, and then they can go back to their performance without being punished. Previously, you couldn't do that. So we are starting within individual sports to see that kind of thing considered. And I think you raise a really important point about, that's not within specific sport. That's the way that athletes are caught up in that broader system of performance and how they get supported with funds and things like that. To my knowledge, nothing in the works, but I really appreciate the comment.